Hello, and thanks for tuning in for another session of Back Porch Catechetics. This short video will focus on virtues in reference to Catechism of the Catholic Church, 1833 to 1840. Catholics always speak of virtues as a habit, and the terminology here is revealing and worth diagramming a bit. The English habit comes from the Latin habitus, which means something like to be held or something held. The basic idea is a gift exchange. A habitus is a gift. And so when we think of a virtue as a habit, well, we're always thinking of the giver and the gift and, of course, the receiver. The basic cycle is one here which is very deeply wed to our understanding of a blessing. You are probably already familiar with the cycle of blessing, but in the cycle of blessing we talk about God giving and humans receiving in order that we might give back to God. The prayer in the Mass, "Blessed are you, Lord God of all creation. Through your goodness we have this bread to offer you," very much outlines that basic pattern and our understanding of how a habit or a gift comes from God. Now, when we think in terms of a virtue, we also want to separate things which are held naturally to us or things which God has maybe already given us by creating us human, and separate those from things which God gives to us distinctly upon being Christians. So while certain virtues, all virtues will have this basic understanding that they're gifts from God, we'll want to separate some along those lines. Now, the relatively natural virtues, the ones that we think every human has, are often called human or natural or cardinal virtues. The cardinal virtues are often broken up along a series of four. We speak of prudence, temperance, justice, and fortitude, or courage, strength. The theological virtues are often contrasted with the cardinal virtues precisely along that line that we were discussing just a minute ago, that they come from God. And they come from God with special graces only after we become Christian. The theological virtues are faith, hope, and love. Now, since the cardinal virtues, justice and temperance and prudence and fortitude, since these are thought to belong to humans naturally, there's the sense that, any human who wants can reach out towards God, and these sort of already belong to us. And we can try to be prudent in an offering to God. They belong to us by virtue of being created human. We can be prudent, we can use some wisdom, some judgment, we can exercise temperance, we can be balanced, we can try harder to be just, or we can work for justice even from our own abilities, and we can have courage or strength. Or another way of thinking about this is, if you're wanting to engage a conversation about the virtues, it seems to most theologians you could have a conversation with anyone about prudence, temperance, justice, and fortitude, and we ought to mean more or less the same kinds of things. These are things by which we try to make ourselves better, and we can do this alone or with community, and there are obviously various schools of thought about how to develop virtue, but you get the point. When we transition to thinking about faith, hope, and love, these theological virtues, well, Christian theologians say these actually require some unique grace from God given to us, in order that we might return. So our use of the theological virtue of faith, the theological virtue of hope, the theological virtue of love, our use of those virtues is always going to be premised on some extra grace from God. And this is why we're always talking about a grace of faith or a grace of hope or a grace of love. Now, that does not deny that those have human senses. Of course, people who are not already Christian can have faith. They believe in something. They can have hope. They can, look for something better in the future. And of course, people love. It's not that theologians are trying to deny that that exists already at a kind of human or cardinal level, but rather that what we mean by these is infused by a special grace. And that's a different category of the cardinal virtues. So, in a nutshell, we can think of cardinal virtues as the way that humans can kind of begin on our own to reach towards God to be better, and the theological virtues as a way that God reaches to us to allow us to reach back to God. After we have that basic picture in mind, that some we're going to talk about needing extra grace or a certain premise of grace differently from others, I think we can think more about what virtue does in the structure of human life. Now, there are lots of ways of thinking about human actions or diagramming what it means to be human. I'm fond of using the kind of 4 parts, where we're trying to explain what it means to be human. And to be human is to have something physical or a body. And we've said to be human means to have a soul, something immaterial or not physical. It means to have a purpose or a goal. And it means to exist in relation. And we'll often want to talk about relationships with other humans, but also theologically our relationship with God. These would not be exhaustive of what it would mean to discuss a human, but I find the 4 parts helpful, especially when we try to think about sacraments. And you may be familiar with some of that thought, that a sacrament is, an outward sign of an inward grace instituted by Christ for the purpose of our sanctification. But we can also lay out a slightly different but related understanding of how we make a human action, or what kinds of things are involved in the timeline for a human to perform some action. Most people will analyze that actions are going to begin with some kind of impulse. Now, this impulse can come from entirely within me. It can kind of be generated by my own thoughts, my own desires, right? I can consult all these aspects of me and think, oh, I'm hungry. And so that will usually be translated into some action, go get food, right? But there are other impulses which might come from without, right? Maybe I think of, someone doing me wrong, someone cutting me off in traffic, and then that raises within me anger and some desire to respond in kind, perhaps, to the person. Right? These impulses affect us. And we would want to make a full analysis of emotion and how emotion works and cooperates with this. Is it the same thing as an impulse, or is it different? These are complicated discussions. I'm simply marking that it would belong somewhere at this initial stage of impulse. Something appears to me to be the thing to do, either from an external stimulus or an internal stimulus. Now, I think this is more or less, normal, that most people will agree, but I recognize not everyone is going to have the same basic analysis of human actions, so with caution we'll proceed. After we have an impulse, there's the sense that, humans get to engage in some thought process. We actually think about that impulse. Maybe it happens very quickly, but it's like, I'm hungry. Is that good? Do I want to eat that? Right? And when we think that through, we're doing that in light of what we might call some desire. And if desire and impulse are too closely related for you, this desire could be a goal, our purpose, right? It would correspond to something like this. And, some of the spirit or the soul and some of the body would be involved in the impulse and the emotions and all these things. But at least some of the soul and maybe some of the body is involved in our thinking process as well. Maybe it's in our desire, but that would correspond to purpose on our other way of analyzing. And then at some point we commit. We choose. And this is typically, the faculty of the will. We might call this the mind, and sometimes we call this the heart, but it's not always the heart. There's the I want something, I love it, but there's also, like, I have a goal to stay in shape, and that's not always best thought of as the heart. Point is, it would be just as appropriate to say, I desire donuts, as it would be to say I desire a slim waistline, and those are perhaps competing desires. We'll think about them, and we'll commit and choose to one of them when the impulse to eat happens. And so this would be something like our will or our ability to love. Right, again, we're analyzing human action, and we're saying there's at least these 4 steps in the process. So I get an impulse, it says do something, and then I need to think about it quickly. I need to compare it to my bigger picture goals, long-term goals, and I need to make up my mind. I need to choose. This pattern is actually habitual. I mean, that's what we often say, right? I'm in the habit of, well, if I'm in the habit of smoking, it's like as soon as I get the impulse to smoke, I do not really have to think much about it. I do not have to weigh my desires, and I'm already committed to it. So that habit is a predisposition. Right? It says, when confronted with this kind of thing, we have a pre-plan. We know what we're going to do. And as soon as this step 1 happens, step 2, 3, and 4 follow right in line. Now, when that predisposition is to good, well, we call that a virtue. And when it is to bad or to evil, we call it a vice. The point I think we're seeing is that this analysis of human action, this axis, this process, shows us, in a way, the axis of virtue and vice in human life. And the Catechism defines, right at the opening of this section in paragraph 1833, that virtue is a habitual and firm disposition to do the good. Virtue is a habitual and firm disposition to do the good. It's something we hold, it's something we have, something we've developed over time, and it's going to organize this process so that we choose the good and commit to the good over and over. Now, we know this in our lives. You can go to plenty of life coaches who are going to have similar processes for analyzing this. Write down your thoughts in a journal. Give me your long-term goals. Let's set some goals and objectives. Let's talk about to what we're going to commit. And we know we can work back and forth on these, right? We can make a commitment to losing a certain amount of weight and then use that to articulate our goals and objectives and try to help our thought process. There's even a sense that as we develop in virtue and vice, that might even change our impulses or reshape them. I mean, there's this fascinating way in which you can really transition from, hungering for junk food to hungering for fruit. And that's a kind of conversion that a lot of people make, multiple times throughout their lives, right? Different things stand in different relief to us. All right, virtue and vice, or that habitus, would name this process, and it also shows that we have some influence on this process. In some sense, we're in control of it. Now, let's think a little more carefully about the conditions that need to exist in order for the virtue to play out, or in order for the vice to play out. In terms of how we would think this through, we would pretty easily say, any condition on thought is going to have something ultimately to do with the truth, right? Like if our thinking mechanism, if our brain, our mind, if it's not able to see the truth, then we're not going to do this very well, right? I mean, it's a little tongue-in-cheek, but say I have an impulse to solve a calculus problem. But like if I don't know calculus, I can't go very far with that impulse. Or worse yet, if I've learned arithmetic poorly, and if I think that the truth of the matter is that 2 + 2 = 49, then I'm always going to be hamstrung, and this process is always going to lead to vice. So there's a truth condition on getting this human action right, so to speak, or getting it wrong, so to speak. Similarly, when we think about this desire or these goals, well, there might be a truth condition on them, like, is it even possible for me to play in the NBA or something, be a professional athlete given my particular body? But there's also a sense in which we have to sit with the condition for a good goal, I think. And we sometimes set bad goals or the wrong goal for ourselves. And I don't just mean an impossible goal. I mean, we desire something that in and of itself is just not right. Perhaps we desire power for the sake of power, or money for the sake of money, or perhaps we desire rage to get back at someone. That would not be a good desire. And inasmuch as our desires might be inclined towards something evil, well, then this process would play out along that line of vice. But inasmuch as those desires might, be aligned towards the good, then that would play out towards virtue. We could also put beauty in here, though for the sake of today's diagram, I think I'd like to put beauty with our choice, that we choose the beautiful. Now, I'm readily admitting truth, goodness, and beauty line up this way neatly for me because I'm forcing these to be three distinct things. Maybe the discussion is more complicated than that. But for the sake of a simple diagram, reviewing a few principles, I think you can see sort of where we're headed. There's a condition of truth, there's a condition of goodness, there's a condition of beauty, and wrapped up in that beauty is really a condition of freedom. If I am not free to choose, then I cannot fully engage in this. In fact, that's the way we most often talk about habits and addictions, right? An addiction limits your freedom because it doesn't leave you free to choose. In essence, you've already chosen, right? If you are addicted to, one of these impulses, then it's like as soon as the impulse comes, your choice is already taken away, or it's already made. And so if we want this to be, fully human, then that choice has to be free. And we could just as easily say that it has to be free in the beauty, or free in the truth, or free in the good. Now, this little insight or way of analyzing things gives us some insight into virtue, and particularly into why we would think about the theological virtues as premised on extra grace. Because it's really going to be a profound understanding of faith, which allows us to have our thought rooted in truth. And it's really going to be a profound sense of hope, which allows us to have our desire rooted in the good. And it's really going to be a profound sense of love or charity, which allows us to always choose or to be committed to beauty and to be free. Love, in the end, truly exists in and for freedom. Freedom exists in order that we may love. Right, we've sketched these theological virtues as in some way responding to a relatively basic and natural understanding of human action. And in that sense, we could think of the vices as the perversion or the opposite, some kind of attachment to the false, or some kind of attachment to the bad or the evil or the ugly, or some kind of closing in of our freedom and preventing this process from playing out. To be fully free, to be fully human, this process of a human action has to definitely be free, and it has to have full knowledge of what's at stake. So a virtue as a habitual and firm disposition to do the good really answers this. This also gives us some insight to think about specific virtues, and perhaps that they might have a function primarily in one aspect of human existence, right? That there may be virtues like prudence, right, that often is in line with our thought, or temperance in line with our desires, and fortitude in line with our commitments, that we might think of cardinal or theological virtues that are particularly strong or relevant to one or other aspect of this analysis of human action. I think we've also articulated a sense in which this analysis of human action and virtue is speaking of something stronger than simple preferences, right? This includes a knowing and a free choice for the good. And in that respect, it could include sacrifice in the present for a better future, or it could include sacrifice of the self for another. And in that sense, we're talking about something more than just a single action, but the way a single action plays a role in shaping further action or entire patterns of behavior. And again, this is what we mean by offering an analysis of virtue in human actions.